You let a man into my house wearing my slippers?
I thought you were dead, Dan.
Damn, Dan blurted. He lunged toward the car, splashing ankle-deep through the water that had flooded the road. In the driver's seat, he saw a figure. The person was not moving. Dan tried the driver's door. Locked. He rapped on the window. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. The hazard lights flashed inside the cabin, strobing over the face of the woman behind the wheel. Do not scroll. The most interesting part is ahead. Subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment. Thank you for staying with us. 1 hour earlier, Dan McLean stepped onto the solid ground of his hometown after nearly a year away. 10 months on deployment, then 6 weeks of an unexpected extension due to rotation, and here he was again, home at last. Exhausted, a heavy pack on his shoulders, he drew in a lungful of cool October air. His heart pounded. Ahead lay the long-awaited reunion with his wife, Laura. A few minutes later, the taxi dropped him in front of a 2-story house on a quiet suburban street. Dan studied the familiar facade, trying to catch that feeling of being back. Lights glowed in the windows. She is home, he thought with relief. At last he would hold her, and all the doubts would dissolve. During his service, communication with Laura had been cut off by system outages. Dan knew she might have been worried. He phoned when he could, seldom wrote emails, but during the last month he had not had a single chance to get through. That was all behind them now. I am back. He walked up to the door and took a deep breath. He had his key, but Dan decided to knock, picturing Laura throwing herself into his arms. The door swung open on his second round of loud knocks. Laura stood on the threshold, eyes wide, face ashy pale. She looked as if she had seen a ghost. For a moment they stared in silence. Dan managed a tentative smile. "Laura, I am home." Dan," she finally forced out. Her voice trembled. He reached to touch the woman he loved, but Laura did not move. Over her shoulder, a man's shape appeared in the hallway. "Who is it, Laura?" An unfamiliar male voice called. Dan's gaze slid past his wife and landed on a tall, close-cropped man in casual clothes, wearing Dan's house slippers, standing a few paces behind her. The man stopped when he saw Dan and looked both startled and wary. Laura said nothing. Her shoulders quivered. "Laura, what is going on?" Dan asked sharply, his eyes cutting to the stranger. His heart was thudding now not with joy, but with dread. "Dan, you are alive," she whispered, tears flashing in her eyes. "Of course I am alive. Why would I not be?" He could not make sense of her reaction. His eyes slid back to the stranger in his home. "Who is this, Laura?" The stranger stepped forward with his palms raised in a calming gesture. "Hey, I am Nick. A friend," he began quietly. "You must be Dan." "We." "A friend." Dan's brows drew into a scowl. Heat beat in his temples. "What are you doing in my house, buddy?" "Dan, wait." Laura snapped out of it at last, stepping forward and almost shielding Nick with her body. "It is not what you think." "And what am I supposed to think?" Dan's voice cracked into a shout. He stepped over the threshold. His heavy pack thumped to the floor. "I come home, and there is some man walking around my house in my slippers answering my door." "You call him a friend?" Laura burst into tears. I thought you had been killed." Silence fell for several seconds. Dan stared at her, not trusting his own ears. "What did you say?" he rasped. I was told your unit came under fire, and for a month there was no word from you," Laura sobbed, palms pressed to her mouth. "I did not know how to go on. I thought you were not coming back." Dan swayed as if struck. During that wretched operation, when contact really had vanished for a few weeks, he had never imagined she could have received a false notification. "Well, sorry to disappoint. Here I am," he said, spreading his hands as his throat tightened with hurt. "Alive. I came back." Laura gave a bitter little sob and lowered her head. It was a mistake. Later they walked it back, but she glanced at Nick, who stood behind her with fists clenched. "I was shattered, Dan. It was as if someone had cut me off from life." Dan shot a look at Nick, imagining what the man had been doing here all that time. His stomach nodded with what those images implied. "And he helped you get back to life?" Dan asked, acid in his voice and fire in his eyes. Nick shifted his weight. "Listen, man, it really is not what you think. Are you going to shut up or not?" Dan took a hard step toward Nick, shoulders rising. Rage pulsed at his temples. "What I see is simple. A stranger in my home next to my wife." "Dan, please," Laura cried, clutching his arm. "Do not do this." He felt the warmth of her hand and paused for a heartbeat. He looked into her eyes and read despair there and guilt. Guilt, which meant his worst suspicions might be true. "Tell me one thing," Dan said hoarsely, trying to steady the wild hammering of his heart. "Did you betray me with him?" Laura moaned and shook her head. "No, I do not know. We did not. It is very complicated." Without a clear answer, Dan tore his arm free of her grasp. Nick started forward, as if to explain something or shield Laura, but Dan was faster. "Get out," he said quietly, in a voice edged with danger, staring straight into Nick's eyes. "Get out of my house before I lose control." "Dan!" Laura screamed. "Do not." Nick must have realized that arguing with a military man just back from the front was foolish. He lifted his hands in surrender. "I will go. Call me if you need anything, Laura." He tossed over his shoulder and hurried for the door, edging past Dan. Dan clenched his fists, fighting not to let the fury turn physical. His vision went dark with anger and hurt. When the door slammed behind Nick, the house became so quiet it rang. Laura wept, back against the wall, hands covering her face. Dan stood in the entry, breathing hard. Something in his chest was tearing. Was that despair? "How could you?" He croaked, but he could not finish. His throat closed. Laura dropped her hands and looked at him through tears. "You do not understand. I thought you were gone. I was alone." "Alone?" He laughed harshly, feeling his own hot tears rise. "It has not even been 11 months, and you already— Damn it!" He smashed his fist into the doorjamb so hard paint flaked off. The pain in his knuckles barely registered. His heart hurt far worse. Laura flinched at the blow. "Forgive me, please." Dan shook his head. Suddenly, the hallway felt tight and airless. Her perfume still lingered there, but he could feel another person's presence, too. He had to get out. He bent, snatched up his pack, and turned for the door. "Dan, do not go!" Laura cried in despair, grabbing his forearm. "We need to talk." He stopped for a breath, love, anger, and pain wrestling inside him. He wanted to turn back, to ask questions, to shout, to cry everything at once. But humiliation stood there like a wall. "I cannot right now," he forced out between clenched teeth, staring past her. "If I stay, I am afraid I will say too much, or do something." Without waiting for an answer, Dan yanked his arm free and bolted for the exit. He flung open the door and ran outside into the deepening dusk, where a cold autumn rain was starting to fall. He was shaking whether from fury or shock. He could not tell. Laura remained inside, and Dan did not look back as she sank to the floor in tears. He took the porch steps in a bound and headed down the street with no destination, leaving the shattered comfort of his home behind. Dan trudged through the rain, not seeing the way. The cold drops soaked him quickly, but he did not care. The last few minutes spun in his head in a chaotic reel. She thought I was dead. His heart clenched with pain and insult. The wind rose, driving rain into his face. Dan did not even raise his hood, feeling the cold water run down his neck. The physical discomfort dimmed beside what he felt inside. He had pictured his reunion with Laura so many times, joyful tears, embraces, kisses on the threshold. Instead, he had found emptiness and betrayal. Thunder cracked, very close. Dan flinched and ducked by instinct. A sharp flash lit the street ahead for a heartbeat. Trees bowed under the wind and an intersection with a blinking yellow light. He no longer quite knew where he was. Even the town felt strange. Up ahead, about 100 meters away, he saw a bridge over a little creek that ran along the edge of the neighborhood. Dan remembered that bridge. The small channel beneath could spill its banks during heavy rain. Now the water already roared louder than usual, and he could hear it over the downpour. Suddenly another sound knifed through the gale, the screech of metal and a dull thud. Dan froze. Something had happened near the bridge. He sprinted toward it, pushing himself despite the slick, water-sheened road. As he reached the approach, headlights glared in the middle of the street. A car sat at an angle. It looked as if it had slammed into the bridge rail. Water from the overfilled creek was already sloshing across the pavement. Dan ran closer. Through the rain, he made out a sedan that had clearly skidded on the turn. The front end had smashed through the wooden guardrail, and the car hung nose down over the raging water. Another moment, and it would plunge. "Damn," Dan blurted. He rushed to the vehicle, splashing ankle-deep through the flood on the road. Inside, in the driver's seat, he saw a figure. The person was not moving. Dan tried the driver's door. Locked. He banged on the glass. "Hey, can you hear me?" No reaction. The hazard lights blinked inside, washing the face of the woman at the wheel in pulses of light. Dan glanced around. No one. This was a wicked hour, and everyone was home. The wind moaned, the rain lashed. He yanked the handle again. Useless. Squinting through the downpour, he peered at the windshield. A crack on the passenger side. Maybe she struck her head. He had to hurry. The water was rising. The car was tipping farther forward. Dan ran to the other side, closer to the broken railing. There, the sedan still clung to the bridge by its rear wheels. His heart hammered faster, but battle had taught him to act under pressure. The smashed railing gave him a way to reach the passenger door. The glass on that side was cracked. Dan grabbed a chunk of a broken concrete post nearby and smashed the window. The glass rained inward onto the seat. He carefully opened the passenger door and leaned into the cabin. "I am going to get you out of here. Hold on." The woman did not react. She seemed unconscious. Dan scrambled across the seats toward the driver's side and loosened the shoulder belt across her chest. The car rocked ominously. When the latch clicked free, he gathered the stranger in both arms and tried to haul her out through the passenger side. It was awkward. She was limp and heavy, and his elbows jammed against the seats. The wind howled outside as if warning him. The car lurched, the rear wheels began sliding back. Dan summoned everything he had. With a roar swallowed by thunder, he finally dragged the woman out through the shattered window. The instant he stepped back onto the roadway, holding her tight, the car lost its last purchase. With a rending crack, the sedan pitched nose first into the churning current beneath the bridge. It vanished into the muddy dark with a grinding scrape, swept away. Dan stood knee-deep in water on the flooded road, gasping. The rescued woman lay in his arms. Her face was pale, dark hair plastered to her forehead. She looked young, in her early 30s. There was an abrasion, a bleeding cut on her brow, washed by the rain. She was barely breathing, but alive. "You are all right. You are safe," Dan murmured, more to steady himself than her, and carried her away from the bridge to where the water was shallower. He laid the stranger on a drier patch of asphalt beneath a street lamp that still worked. The yellowish light fell over her face. She might have bitten her tongue or lip in the impact. Dan pressed his ear to her chest. Her heart was beating. Her pulse was weak, but there. "Just keep breathing," he whispered, pulling his wet phone from his pocket. His fingers shook from cold and adrenaline. He dialed 911, briefly reported the crash and the location. Help would come, but in this weather it could take about 10 minutes or longer. He shrugged off his soaked jacket and draped it over the unconscious woman to give her a little warmth. He was left in a t-shirt, but that did not matter. He knelt beside her, cradling her head so it did not rest on the cold pavement. Icy rain beat on their faces. The woman rasped and began to cough. Dan carefully rolled her onto her side to help her clear her airway. She gulped at the air. Then she groaned. Her eyelids fluttered and slowly opened. Brown eyes, fogged with pain, tried to focus on him. Who are you?" she whispered hoarsely. "Easy." Dan leaned closer, his hands steady on her shoulders. "I am Dan. I pulled you out of the car. You were in a crash." She blinked, trying to piece it together, and gave a faint moan. "The car, "Hush. You are all right," he said as calmly as he could, though he hardly believed it himself. "You are not badly hurt. The medics will be here soon." She squinted, whether from pain or the rain lashing her face, and suddenly grabbed his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for her condition. "Do not leave," she forced out between ragged breaths. The simple, frightened plea resonated in his battered spirit. Someone needed him, clung to him as if to a lifeline. He covered her hand with his palm. "I am not going anywhere. I promise." They stayed like that, he on his knees on the wet asphalt, she lying beneath his jacket, holding onto his hand. The storm raged around them, but Dan watched only her pale face. He did not even know her name, yet he felt a strange bond, maybe because he had just pulled her back from the edge, or maybe because right now someone desperately needed him there. Ghostly minutes dragged on. At last sirens sounded in the distance. The woman was slipping toward unconsciousness again. She only moaned now and then, but she did not let go of his hand. Dan looked up. Headlights forced their way toward the bridge, an ambulance, a police cruiser, and a fire engine. Help had arrived. He exhaled in relief. "They are going to take you to the hospital," he told her gently, unsure whether she could hear. "You are going to be all right." The stranger gave the slightest nod. Her eyes closed again, but her fingers still held his. Medics with a stretcher hurried to them through the rain. Dan did not release her hand until they had lifted her carefully onto the litter. One of the M's touched his shoulder. "Are you riding with her? Are you family?" Dan hesitated. He was not family, but he could not make himself leave her. "I will go," he said simply. The medics hurried back to the ambulance with the woman. Dan snatched his soaked jacket off the ground. A sharp pain flared in his left arm. He must have scraped it on glass or banged it during the rescue. It was nothing. He ran after them. When the doors thudded shut behind them, the storm was out there somewhere else. Inside the rig, the light was dim, the air smelled of antiseptic, and it was warm. Dan dropped onto the bench beside the stretcher. The stranger lay there under a blanket with an oxygen mask in place. An EMT adjusted in Roman 4 and checked her injuries. "You got to her in time," the medic said to Dan over the wail of the siren and the heavy drumming of rain on the roof. Another minute, and it would have been over. Dan only nodded and looked at the woman's pale face. His thoughts were a tangle. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to process it all. The ambulance cut through the night with sirens, and Dan held the hand of a woman he did not know, but whose life now somehow rested with him. Red and blue lights flickered ahead. This town was welcoming him back with a storm. Dan spent the rest of the night at the hospital. The ambulance took them to the nearest trauma unit. Casey, that was the rescued woman's name, as he learned from her faint whisper on the way, was taken straight into an exam room. They insisted on examining Dan, too. Deep cuts on his left forearm from glass and a long scrape across his shoulder. A nurse rinsed and dressed the wounds quickly, and a doctor checked his pupils and asked whether he had hit his head. Dan answered on autopilot, his mind with Casey. Outside the downpour still raged. Wrapped in a hospital blanket, Dan sat in a hard plastic chair in the corridor. His wet clothes had been bagged. He wore clean, slightly too large hospital pants and a t-shirt. He shivered, whether from chill or from nerves, he could not say. At last, the doctor stepped out of Casey's room. Dan stood, searching the man's face. "Are you with the patient?" the doctor asked. I found her after the crash," Dan explained, aware he was neither family nor even an acquaintance. "How is she?" The doctor rubbed his brow, weary. "What you did saved her life, young man. She has a concussion, a chest contusion, and several cuts, but nothing critical. We sutured the wound on her forehead and treated the rest. She has regained consciousness, but she needs rest." Dan let out a breath he had been holding. "Thank you, doctor. May I see her?" The physician nodded kindly. "I think a few minutes would be all right. She asked whether you were here. She said you saved her." Something warm stirred in Dan's chest. After this long, terrible night, he had become a hero to someone, even a stranger. "I am here," he said softly. "I will go in for a minute." The doctor patted his shoulder. Only for a short while. She needs to sleep. Dan slipped into the room. A night lamp cast a gentle glow over the bed where Casey lay. A white bandage wrapped her head, and Roman 4 line ran into her arm. She looked exhausted but aware. Hearing his steps, Casey turned her head and managed a small smile. You did stay, she whispered. Of course, Dan pulled up a chair beside the bed. I promised I would not go anywhere. She nodded, eyes bright with moisture. Thank you, Dan, right? The doctor said. Yes, Dan McLean, he confirmed. And you are Casey. I am sorry, I already know your name. You said it in the ambulance when they were asking you questions. It is all right. She gave a tiny laugh that turned into a painful cough. Casey winced and pressed a hand to her bandaged ribs. Oh, easy. Dan started to help her settle more comfortably, but she gestured that she was fine. Her breathing steadied, though her face had gone pale from the stab of pain. He sat again. For a few seconds they were quiet, she studying him, he studying her. Casey broke the silence first. They told me you are military. She nodded toward his wrist, where a yellow rubber bracelet glinted, the kind service members often wear. Fresh bandage showed on his forearm. Yes, United States Marine. I just got back from a tour, Dan answered simply. And you ran straight into a fight to rescue some foolish girl who lost control of her car, Casey said with a crooked, self-mocking smile. Hey, he said gently, you are not foolish. It really was dangerous out there, sheets of rain, that bridge. It could have happened to anyone. She shook her head and looked down. I lost control of more than the car. I was not myself. I was very upset. Dan did not ask, but perhaps his face showed sympathy because Casey went on. Today, well, it was yesterday already was a hard day. The anniversary of my husband's death. She swallowed the lump in her throat, but held herself together. Dan let a moment pass, then said quietly, I am very sorry. Casey gave a sad smile. He was in the service too. He was killed in the line of duty 2 years ago. I thought I was finally dealing with it, but on days like this, it all comes flooding back. She sighed, and her eyes filled with tears again, but she did not look away. I went to the cemetery, then a storm started. I was driving home and crying. I did not see the turn. And then, well, you know the rest. Dan felt his chest tighten. It hurt to hear about her loss. He hardly knew this woman, yet she had trusted him so openly. I am sorry I am unloading all of this, Casey said with a small, awkward laugh, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. It is probably just because you are the first person I have talked to about it in a very long time. Do not apologize, Dan said, shaking his head. I am glad to listen if it makes things easier. He hesitated for a moment, then added, I have had losses too, in the war. Casey looked at him closely. It must have been hard. Dan lowered his gaze. In his mind, he saw the face of the buddy who had died to an improvised explosive device not long ago. Yes, he exhaled. But the worst is losing the people who were beside you every day. She nodded quietly. It seemed they understood each other without extra words. You said you just got back from deployment, Casey said after a small pause. Did anyone meet you? I am sorry. Maybe that is not an appropriate question. Dan gave a bitter smile. You could say that. My wife. Casey's eyes widened. Oh, I am sorry. I did not know you were married. It is all right, he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose with his palm. The situation is complicated. She did not pry, but there was sympathy and curiosity in her look. Dan felt a strange urge to open up, though he usually kept everything to himself. She thought I had been killed, he said quietly, hardly believing his own words now. They sounded so absurd. There was some mix-up with the notifications, and he clenched his jaw, trying to hold back his emotions. And when I came home, there was another man in my house, he finished at last. The room went completely still. Casey blinked a few times, processing what she had heard. God, Dan, she whispered. That is horrible. He felt a bitter heat rise in his throat, but he only shrugged. It happened. Casey reached out using the hand that did not have the Roman 4 and timidly laid it over the hand he had clenched on his knee. "I am very sorry," she said again. "You are not with her now, are you?" "No, I just walked out. I do not know what happens next," Dan exhaled. Her fingers gave his a gentle squeeze. "I hope you two can work it out. If the love was real, you can get through this." Dan said nothing. He himself did not know if there was anything left to work through. The image of Laura with someone else still stood vivid in his head. But here, next to Casey, it was a little easier to talk about it. He did not want to move his hand from beneath hers, but just then the door to the hospital room opened again. A nurse came in. "I am sorry, ma'am, you need to rest. And you," she said with a nod to Dan, "come back tomorrow if you like." Casey withdrew her hand, and Dan felt the coolness where it had been. He stood. "Yes, of course. I am going now." The nurse checked the readings on the monitor and jotted something in the chart. Dan glanced at Casey. "May I come tomorrow to see how you are doing?" She gave the faintest smile. "I would really like that." "Then I will see you tomorrow," he said with a nod. "See you tomorrow, Dan." He left the room feeling something settle inside him along with the exhaustion, quiet contentment from the conversation they had just had. Despite the pain and despair gnawing at him because of Laura's betrayal, Dan had found unexpected comfort that night in the words and warmth of another woman. Morning found Dan in a cheap roadside motel. After a sleepless night at the hospital, he had taken a cab and told the driver the first motel that came to mind. His whole body ached with fatigue and tension, and the cuts on his arm throbbed with a dull pain. His soul hurt more. When he woke after a few hours of restless sleep, Dan saw dozens of missed calls and messages on his phone. Laura, she had written, begged him to respond, asked where he was and whether he was all right. With a heavy sigh, he typed a short message. "I need time. I am safe. We will talk later." He hit send and set the phone down. Outside the motel window, the sky was still gray and sullen, but the storm had blown through. Dan sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the cracked wall. Two women, two realities that had changed his life in a single day. At last, Dan forced himself to get up. He took a hot shower, washing away grime and fatigue. He put on a clean t-shirt and jeans from his backpack. He looked at himself in the mirror. The old spark had vanished from his eyes, and dark circles lay beneath them. A man stood there who had been through a war and was now fighting a personal war at home. His phone chimed with a ringtone. "Laura." Dan tensed, but decided he could not keep running. "Hello," he said hoarsely. "Dan." Her voice was tight, raw from crying or lack of sleep. "Thank God. Where are you? I was going out of my mind." "I am fine," he cut in, gripping the phone harder. Silence on the other end, just her quickened breathing. "Forgive me," Laura whispered. "Please come home. We need to talk. I will explain everything." Dan closed his eyes. He wanted so badly not to go back to that house, where everything reminded him of the shock from the day before. But avoiding the conversation was not an option either. "All right," he said quietly. "I will come." "I will be waiting," she breathed. About an hour later, Dan stood on the familiar porch. His heart thudded anxiously, but the fury of the day before was gone overnight. It had burned off, leaving emptiness behind. He unlocked the door with his own key. Laura was curled up on the living room couch. The moment she saw him, she sprang to her feet. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hair a little wild. She looked almost the way she had on the day they said goodbye before he left. She had cried a lot then, too. The thought stung. "Dan," she began, but he raised a hand, asking her to wait. He stepped inside, shut the door, and slowly set his backpack on the floor. The distance between them was only a few yards, but it felt impassable. "I am listening," he said softly. Laura's fingers worried the hem of her sweater. "I have no excuse, but I want you to know exactly how it happened." Dan nodded in silence, remaining where he stood. She sighed and ran a trembling hand through her hair. After you left, I tried to be strong, to wait for you. Every day I prayed that you would come home alive and unharmed. Her voice shook, but she went on. Do you remember when things happened over there? When communication went dark for a couple of weeks? Dan's face clouded. He had replayed that mountain firefight many times when they had been cut off from the base. I remember, he answered in a rough voice. Command called us, Laura continued. They said your unit had come under fire, that there were casualties, and that you were missing in action. She started to cry again, but caught herself and wiped away the tears. For 2 full weeks, I did not know whether you were alive. Then the message arrived that you had been killed in that battle. What? Dan could not hold back the outburst. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. But that was a mistake. Why did no one tell me anything? Later they told me it had been a mistake, Laura said through tears. But only after a few days, and by then I was dead inside. She wrapped her arms around herself as if warding off the memory. Dan sank slowly into a chair. He pictured her state. To receive word of his death, it was worse than any blow. Laura, he began, but she shook her head. Let me finish. She wiped her cheeks with her sleeve. After that, I broke. They took me to the hospital that night with a nervous collapse. My mother flew in to support me. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. There, at the hospital, I met Nick. He was visiting his brother, who was in the IQ. We started talking by chance, and when he learned that I had just been widowed, she swallowed hard. He was there for me. Later, we saw each other again at a support group for families of fallen service members that my mom signed me up for. Dan listened without interrupting, but his jaw clenched tighter with every word. Nick, he lost his father in the war about 10 years ago. He understood what I was going through. We started talking. He was just there as a friend, Laura said, pleading with her eyes. I swore to myself it was only friendly support in grief. I loved you even when I thought you might never come back. She took a step closer, but Dan did not move. When they told me it had been a mistake, you still were not getting in touch, and I did not know when to expect you. My nerves were like a guitar string. Nick kept stopping by. He fixed the fence, brought groceries, just talked to me and pulled me away from the terrible thoughts. And you got attached to him, Dan said, not so much asking as stating. Laura trembled under his gaze. I do not know. It felt good to have someone caring nearby. But the moment you came back, everything turned upside down. I know how it looked. But please believe me, there was nothing between us. He only once. She faltered, lowering her eyes. He kissed me, and I let him because I was lonely and hopeless. It happened a few days before you returned. Dan's heart clenched as if from a blow. Heat rushed to his face. There it was, the confirmation he had dreaded to hear. He closed his eyes, living through the moment. Laura was sobbing. I am awful. I betrayed you in my thoughts, even if almost nothing happened physically. I do not deserve forgiveness, I know, but I was so shattered, Dan. He raised a hand, asking for silence. His head was spinning. Anger, hurt, compassion, it all tangled together. I do not know, he began hoarsely. I do not know what to say, Laura. She came closer, sank to her knees in front of his chair, and took his cold hands in her trembling ones. Tell me we can get through this. Tell me you will forgive me. I love you, Dan. You came back, that is a miracle, a gift of fate. I do not want to lose you. Her tears ran down Dan's hands. He looked at her bowed head, this woman who had been his love, his family for 5 years. She had done something he had never thought he would have to endure, but she had endured the unthinkable too. Gently, he freed one hand and stroked her hair. Laura, I love you too, but right now, we are both in a lot of pain. She raised her tear-streaked face. I am ready to do anything if you will just give me a chance. We can go to church, to a marriage counselor, anywhere. I do not want to lose our life. Dan was silent. He understood that, deep down, he did not want to just erase everything either. They had been through so much together, but the wound of betrayal burned. Maybe therapy really is worth trying, he said quietly. We both have been through trauma. Laura nodded convulsively. Yes, yes, of course. I will find a good specialist. We will try, my love, all right? He did not answer, only drew her head lightly to his knee. He looked out the window, where the sky was slowly brightening after the storm. Hard conversations lay ahead, but for now, at least, they were willing to try to save their marriage. A week later, the McLeans sat in the cozy office of a family therapist. Soft lamplight and the therapist's calm voice eased the tension a little. For the first time, Dan and Laura spoke in detail about everything that had happened, in the presence of a third person, and it felt strange, but it also brought relief. Laura, you felt as if your world collapsed when you received that terrible news. The therapist gently echoed her words. You essentially went through the grief of losing a husband. Laura sniffled softly. Yes, it felt like life was over. The therapist nodded and turned to Dan. And you, Dan, you came back and found a completely different reality. Dan's fingers tightened on his knee. He had just struggled to share how he had imagined the reunion, how he had dreamed of coming home, and how the shock wave hit him when everything fell apart. Yes, it was easier at war than in that moment at home, he admitted in a rough voice. It felt like I had died for her then. Laura covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a sob. The therapist leaned forward slightly. This sounds like post-traumatic stress. You both experienced trauma, but you are both here together trying to talk. That is already good. I want him to know how sorry I am, Laura said through tears. I would give anything to go back to that day and hold on until he came home. Dan glanced away, grim. But you did not hold on. Dan, the therapist interrupted gently, do you think you can forgive your wife? The circumstances were extraordinary. She was certain you were gone. He was silent for a long time. Laura looked at him pleadingly. Images came. Laura with Nick, Laura now broken, guilty. He wanted to forgive, but something inside seemed to hold fast. I do not know, he whispered at last. I am trying very hard, but I do not know if I can forget. Laura began to cry again, covering her face with her hands. The therapist gently guided the session forward, but Dan felt something settle clearly inside him. No matter how hard he tried, the past would not come back. A month after that first session, Dan and Laura left the therapist's office for the last time. They had completed 4 sessions. There had been moments when it seemed that love would heal every wound. They had held hands and remembered happy days. But there had also been blown-up conversations when Dan shut down or when Laura, in despair, begged him to believe her, and he could not hold back bitter words. In the end, by mutual agreement, they decided to separate. Not with hatred, with sadness and gratitude for what they had shared. The therapist helped them discuss practical steps to make the divorce amicably, to divide the property. The hardest thing was saying it to themselves the marriage was over. That day, as Dan packed his last things, Laura helped fold boxes. They hardly spoke. When everything was ready, she stopped by the door, watching him load the boxes into the bed of a rental pickup. Where will you go? She asked quietly. For now, I will rent an apartment somewhere near the base, Dan said. He could not stay in their house anymore. Laura had decided to sell it and move closer to her sister. They stood on the porch side by side, former spouses who had become almost strangers. I truly wish you happiness, Dan, Laura said through tears. You deserve it more than anyone. Dan gave a sad smile. You too. Maybe, with time, all of this will heal. She touched his hand, hesitant. I will always love you in the depths of my heart. Will you ever forgive me? He laid his hand over hers. I have already forgiven you. I just could not forget. Laura nodded, tears running down her cheeks. Dan hugged her tightly one last time. She trembled in his arms, but the hug was peaceful, a farewell. Goodbye, Laura, he whispered. Goodbye, my love, she answered. He let her go and walked to the truck. His heart clenched, but along with the sorrow there was relief. Their painful knot had finally come undone. The engine started, and Dan drove away without looking back. After the divorce, Dan's life took a new course. He submitted a request for early separation from the service. 10 years in the Marine Corps had been an honor, but now he needed a break. His military career had lost its former meaning, and his commanders understood his request. Dan rented a small apartment not far from the town where Casey lived. In the time since the accident, they had stayed in touch by messages. At first, rarely he was wrapped up in his own problems, and she was recovering from her injuries. But in time, the messages became more regular, almost daily. They shared small updates, how the cut on her forehead was healing, how he was doing in therapy. They did not speak directly about anything romantic, but between the lines Dan felt it. They both enjoyed the connection. One warm evening, they agreed to meet in the park by the lake. It was their first date, although they did not call it that. Just two friends who had been through a lot. But Dan's heart hammered when he saw Casey waiting for him by a bench under a wide-spreading willow. She had clearly recovered and looked wonderful. Light brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and a warm smile played on her lips. Only a thin scar on her forehead reminded him of the recent accident. Dan felt an uninvited surge of joy when he saw her. "Hi," he said as he walked up, a little awkward. "Hi, Dan." Casey's eyes lit up. "I am glad to see you in person and not through a phone screen." They hugged friendly, but both of them felt a touch that lasted just a little longer than it should have between just friends. They strolled along the lakeshore. The sun was setting, painting the sky pink and gold. Duck shapes were mirrored on the water. The scene was peaceful and a little magical, nothing like the storms they had weathered. "How are you?" Casey asked gently. "After everything." "I am slowly getting my bearings," Dan said. "I have settled into the apartment. I am thinking about work. I have decided to leave the service." "I understand," she said with a nod. "You need a new beginning." "Exactly," he said, smiling at the corners of his mouth. "And you? Does your head still hurt?" "Hardly at all anymore." Casey touched the scar lightly. "The doctor says I got off lightly, considering the crash." She paused for a moment and looked him in the eyes. "Thanks to you." Dan looked a little abashed. "I am just glad I was there." He remembered holding her in his arms in the rain. His life had been hanging by a thread then, too, in his despair. He might not even have wanted to go on. But saving her had given him purpose. "I have never thanked you properly," Casey said softly. "You literally gave me a second birthday." "Come on," Dan said, resting a hand on her shoulder to stop her. "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe," she smiled. "But the fact remains, you are my hero." She said it playfully, but her voice was sincere. Warmth spread through Dan. "You are strong too, Casey," he said seriously. "What you went through, losing your husband, then holding yourself together so bravely." Casey sighed and dropped her gaze to the lake's calm surface. "Sometimes I do not feel strong, but life goes on, does it not?" "It does," he agreed. "I am learning to live anew too." She looked up at his face. In the soft light, her eyes were the color of honey. "I am very sorry about your marriage. Well, you know." Dan nodded. "I am sorry too, but I think this will be better for both of us." "Do you feel lonely?" she asked quietly. He wanted to say no, but the word stuck. Instead, he answered honestly, "Sometimes very much." He saw the echo of her own loneliness in her eyes. "Me too." They stopped. The sun had almost slipped below the horizon, leaving the last rays. It was quiet, with only a gentle lapping of water. "You know, that night when we talked at the hospital," Dan began. "For the first time in a long while, I felt that someone truly understood me." Casey smiled. "I felt the same. You helped me a lot then." "It is strange so much all at once," he went on, "but I am glad I met you." She took a half step closer. Their hands touched without thinking. Dan gently took her fingers in his. I am glad I met you too, Dan, she almost whispered. He lifted her hand and kissed the back of it, hesitantly, without breaking eye contact. Casey held her breath. A blush rose on her cheeks. I have not felt this in a long time, she confessed. Felt what? He asked softly, taking another small step toward her. Warmth. The sense that the person beside me makes me feel safe and good. Dan was very close now, only a breath between them. He looked into her eyes, searching for even a shadow of doubt. If I hold you right now, will that be right? In response, Casey simply wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed herself to him. He embraced her, feeling her heartbeat next to his. He held her tight, as if he were afraid to let go. This feels so good, she whispered near his ear. Dan stroked her back, breathing in the scent of her hair, a light hint of vanilla and wormwood. They drew back a little, still in each other's arms. Casey lifted her face. Her lips were so close. Dan brushed his thumb along her cheek, wiping away a tear she had not meant to shed. Are you crying? He asked quietly. From happiness, I think, she answered in a husky voice. I did not think I could care for someone again. She did not finish, but Dan understood everything. His heart beat faster. He leaned in and touched her lips with his, very gently. Once, twice. Casey answered him, and their kiss grew longer, warmer, deeper. They poured everything into that kiss, the pain of their losses, the sweetness of hope, the ache for closeness. The cool evening breeze swirled around them, but in each other's arms they were warm. When they pulled apart, both of them were catching their breath, smiling. So, Dan began with a slight smile, does this mean that you and I, that there is something very special between us? Casey finished, resting her hand on his chest where his heart pounded beneath his shirt. I do not want to rush the labels, but I feel good with you, Dan. I feel good with you too, Casey, he said. They stood there a little longer, holding each other and watching the sky darken. Then they walked back down the path, hand in hand. The new feeling between them was fragile, but sincere. A few weeks after that evening by the lake, Dan invited Casey over for dinner. His modest apartment smelled of seared steak and herbs he was cooking, hoping to surprise her. Casey arrived with a bottle of red wine and a warm smile that filled the place with coziness at once. They ate by candlelight at the little kitchen table. They talked and joked as if they had known each other for years. Dan felt at ease. For the first time in a long while, he had relaxed. Casey sat close in a simple blue dress and now and then touched his hand to emphasize some witty point. Those light touches sent warmth through him. After dinner, Dan put on some quiet music. They moved to the living room. Casey looked around his small place. The shelves held a few books, a photograph of his platoon, and a souvenir seashell. Is this from Oceania? She asked, picking up the shell. Yes, I brought it from Guam, he said with a nod, stepping closer. We did amphibious assault training there. It is beautiful. Casey ran her fingers along the shell's spiral. Will you miss the service? Dan shrugged. I suppose I will miss the guys in my platoon, but I think I want to find myself in something new. She set the shell back and turned to him. Do you have ideas? He let his gaze rest on her gentle face, lit by the soft golden lamplight. Do you remember when you said I was your hero? He said quietly. Casey laughed. Oh, forget that. I was just joking. I took it seriously, Dan cut in with a smile. After that night, I did a lot of thinking. Maybe my mission is to save people not in war, but here at home. Interest brightened in her eyes. What do you mean? I signed up to volunteer with emergency services, he admitted. I want to try becoming a paramedic or working in emergency response. Casey's smile bloomed. That is wonderful, Dan. You have a gift for it. I saw it myself. He exhaled in relief. I was afraid you would say, what are you doing after being a Marine? No, she said, taking his hands and looking at him with warmth. I am very proud of you. Dan felt his heart fill with tenderness. Soft jazz played in the background. He gently drew Casey toward him. Shall we dance? She nodded. He put an arm around her waist, and she set her hand on his shoulder. They swayed slowly to the music in the middle of the living room. Dan, Casey whispered after a minute of quiet. HM, I am happy right now. He pulled her closer. So am I. She tipped her head back and looked into his eyes. I did not think I could love anyone again after my husband died. Dan kissed her forehead. I am not in a hurry. We have all the time in the world. Casey answered with a light kiss on his cheek. I know. I just want you to know I love you. Dan's heart skipped a beat. He traced his fingers along her cheek. Casey, I love you too. She smiled through tears of joy, and he pressed his mouth to hers, a long, passionate kiss. Her hands slid behind his neck. His hands stroked her back gently. Both their breaths quickened. Dan felt desire wash over him in a wave, but this time it was not a blind physical urge. It was something deeper, full of love and tenderness. He drew back for a moment and searched her eyes. Are you sure you want this? In answer, Casey pressed her lips to the pulse at his neck, leaving a soft kiss. Then she whispered, Yes, with you, yes. Dan's breath caught. He ran his hand carefully along the curve of her hip, pulling her closer. She gave a small sob of feeling and kissed him again, bolder now. They made their way slowly to the bedroom without breaking their embrace or their kisses. In the half-dark of the room, Dan stopped by the bed. Casey stood before him, tender and desired. He slid his hands along her shoulders, his fingers pausing at the zipper of her dress. There was no fear in her eyes, only trust and love. Let me, he said softly. She nodded, lifting her arms to help him slip the dress off. The fabric whispered to the floor. Casey stood in ivory lace lingerie. Dan drew a breath. She was beautiful. A mark from his kiss trembled on her collarbone, and her chest rose with quickened breaths. He traced the line of her shoulder with his fingertips, down along her arm. Then he drew her gently to him. Feeling the warmth of her nearly bare body was a bliss he had not dared dream of in recent months. Casey trembled in his arms, not from cold, but from desire. She began to unbutton his shirt. Her fingers trembled just a little. Dan helped. He pulled the shirt off and dropped it to the floor. Casey looked at his chest, scattered with the scars of combat wounds and fresh scratches. She touched her lips to a small scar beneath his ribs. Does it hurt? She whispered, meaning the scar and all he had been through. Not anymore, Dan answered, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her again. Not now. They sank down onto the bed. Night wrapped their joined silhouettes in shadow. Dan covered Casey's body with tender kisses, listening to her soft sighs. Her fingers dug into his shoulders each time. When the tension rose to its peak, they crossed the threshold together, holding each other even tighter. It felt as if their wounded souls had joined and warmed one another. After a while, Dan lay on his back, and Casey rested on his chest, tracing a finger along his arm. Sweet quiet filled the room. He stroked her back lightly and pulled a warm throw over their bare bodies. What are you thinking about? She asked in a murmur. Dan smiled up at the ceiling. About how lucky I am. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes. I think I am the lucky one for finding you. He hugged her. Then we are both lucky. I was thinking, maybe we could go to the ocean together sometime. You probably have not taken a vacation in 1,000 years. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. To the ocean. Casey blushed slightly. It matters to me. My husband, Richard, he never got to take me on the trip to the ocean we had planned. We kept putting it off, and then. Dan stroked her hair gently. We will go, wherever you want, even Hawaii. She laughed. Let us start with Florida, then we will see. He nodded, looking at her seriously. I will make any wish of yours come true, and I promise I will not let any storm separate us again. Casey touched his cheek. She kissed him softly, and Dan felt calm and joy fill his chest. After all life's trials, he had found what he had been looking for, a love born from the storm and hope for a future they would build together. New sunrises lay ahead, and they would meet them together, holding each other's hands tight. Subscribe to our channel so you do not miss out, because this one is nothing compared to the next one. If you are under 18, do not even think about pressing next.